Good evening. My name is Samantha, and today I want to talk about Daphne du Maurier's The Birds. If you have heard of this short story, that's wonderful. If you haven't and you've only seen the movie, that's also good. I'll be discussing both, and I will be giving spoilers to both. So the first thing to say about this short story is that it was written and published in the early 1950s. The author is British, and it was published during what was called the Angry Young Men movement in British literature, which has to deal with a lot of disillusionment with society during the post-war years. I also must apologize, my cat is being a little crazy today, so if you hear someone rumbling around, that's just Bowie. The story became even more popular following Hitchcock's film adaptation, which came out in 1963. The central theme of both the short story and the movie is the same: man versus nature, and in this case, nature being savage birds who suddenly go rogue and start attacking humankind. But besides from that, there's a lot of key differences in the film and the short story. The characters, the setting, the endings, and even some of the themes I think are really important to discuss because of those differences. So first and foremost, the short story takes place in England in a coastal community, probably based on du Maurier's native Cornwall. And it's looking at a nuclear family who are battling this sudden disaster. It's much more reminiscent, I think, of more recent dystopian pictures like A Quiet Place, if you've seen that, where it's one family banding together, centered in a home, actually, and battling this exterior monster. Whereas the movie version takes place in Bodega Bay, which is about an hour and a half outside of San Francisco. It's also on the water, a small hamlet. However, the protagonists are urbanites, and I think this is a really important distinction because the protagonist of the short story, Nate, is a part-time farmer. So he's very connected with nature in a way that the protagonists of the movie are not. And by changing the protagonist, you lose something, I think, in the short story's messaging. And this might have been one of the reasons I've read that the author was not happy with the movie adaptation. So a little bit about the protagonist of the short story. Nate Hawken is a part-time farmer, as I mentioned. He was disabled during the war. He has 2 children, a wife who he seems to care about and love, and he's friendly with the fellow farmers in his area. What's really nice about Nate as a protagonist is he has a great respect for nature, and he is also someone who is very observant about nature and doesn't seem to be filled with the kind of hubris that a lot of his fellow countrymen are. One pivotal scene in the short story for me was early on after one of the first early bird attacks, when we're still unsure about how large a threat this problem is. Nate takes about 50 birds that have been killed and after one of the attacks, and bunches them all up and is going to take them to bury them. And he's paying a great deal of reverence there to nature. When he gets to the spot that he's chosen along the coast to bury the birds, actually the wind picks up and they fly out of the bag, and he's not able to bury them. However, he says to himself, it's okay, the wind will take them to the tide will take them further. And he seems to just understand this symbiotic relationship between nature and man, and actually that maybe all animals just are nature, so we're all one, we'll all take care of each other. I have to say as well that I found the short story a lot scarier than the movie, and my partner and I recently watched the movie again, and I think some of that of course has to do with some of the dated scenes in the film version, but I also think it has to do with this other big difference between the the short story and the film. And what that has to do with is setting again. So in the film, Bodega Bay is the nucleus of this bird attack, right? And at the end of the film, you see the protagonist going away in the car towards San Francisco, seemingly out of danger, seemingly to find a place where humanity is at the top of the hierarchy again. That is not the case in the short story whatsoever. In the short story, the small farm family has barricaded themselves inside their cottage, and eventually they lose radio connectivity with the BBC. So they have no idea. The last kind of messages they hear, the idea is that the birds have taken over all of England, if not all over the world. And of course, this is scarier because there is no refuge right now. And I talked in my last video a bit about David Wallace Wells and his book, The Uninhabitable Earth. And something that he talks about is how, as an urbanite, he always thought of the climate change issues as something that would mostly have to do with like the rural community and not something that he would have to deal with as someone in the city. Nature was elsewhere, and kind of these concrete jungles we made were protective in some ways. And I think we're seeing that's not the case, right? I mean, even in my native New York, I see this with Hurricane Sandy, which happened quite shortly after I left the US. And there are still repercussions to that problem years and years later with the metro system, with people who live in the outer boroughs. In the US, in the film version, it's a much more American idea of survival, I think. There's a lot more faith in the institutions. The protagonists in the film version go out into San Francisco, and they hear on the radio that essentially the military or the army has created barricades, and that essentially they have the situation somehow contained and under control. And if we think about the spirit or the zeitgeist of the people in the US in the early 1960s and people in the UK in the early 50s, it's basically that in a nutshell, that the British folks who had experienced the Blitz and who had experienced the Nazis basically at their front door and over their heads had a different kind of conception of their institutions and of the idea of invasions than Americans, who suddenly had this overwhelming zealotry towards their institution, towards their military who saved the day, or as like I always grew up hearing, like, if it wasn't for us, everyone would be speaking German. I think most Americans of a certain generation have heard that headline. So there's also this idea of, with Nate, kind of mocking the naivete of the urbanites that is not present in the movie version. And I want to read you one of his quotes. So he's talking about how probably people in the cities will be understanding this crisis because he doesn't yet know that the birds are also taking over the cities. So he says, "There would be parties tonight in London, like the ones they gave on election nights. People standing around, shouting, laughing, getting drunk. Come and watch the birds." And I totally felt that, right? I think about that. I was thinking also about the election night when Obama won his first term. I was a student in New York City. It was the first time I ever voted. And just the streets were flooded with people. Everyone was amused and happy. Bars were giving out free drinks. We were in the streets. We were kissing. Everything was amazing. It definitely goes down as one of the best nights of my young life. And that's what I was picturing as I was picturing kind of Nate in his imagination projecting his idea on the naivete of the urbanites. Something that both the movie and the short story have in common is the lack of explanation for why the birds suddenly attack. And I really like that Hitchcock kept that ambiguity. So there's this idea in a lot of the commentary that the birds are angry at humanity, but it's not explored too much, and I think it's wise to not project too much onto that from like what we think about nature and how nature is treating us 70 or so years later. But there's an idea that maybe Arctic weather patterns have changed. That's brought up. There's also the idea that the Russians are doing something because the birds have come from the east wind. That's in the short story. And then there's also the mention from one of Nate's kids in the short story, that the Americans will save them, which also like sounds very much like World War II days and what I talked about already. This like lack of information for the why is really, really well done in the short story and makes the story much more sinister. Also makes it so that the focus is on not the why, but like what can we do to survive, which I really like, because right now a big conversation about climate change is about the why, right? And in some ways it matters the why, and it matters who is denying the why, but at the same time, it's like we should just be having conversations about what we can do to change that. And maybe in the US, for example, not subsidizing fossil fuels anymore would be a really good move. So the writing style is classic du Maurier. It's suspenseful, it's sinister. There's a lot of evocative imagery about nature and birds, and you see what she was doing in some of her other novels in this short story. This is the only short story of hers I've ever read, but I've read all her novels, and I've reread Rebecca recently. So I definitely think she's the master of setting. And I just love how she is able to mimic kind of the internal feelings of her characters with the external of the world that they live in. So I already mentioned that the story can be evocative of the Blitz. At the same time, I want to suggest that you don't only read this short story through that lens, as the birds as allegory for the Nazis. Likewise with the film. You can read the film as a commentary from Hitchcock on the nature of like modern loose women. I mean, birds is even a slang term, right, for women in the UK. And kind of like when women are loose, they will, you know, fight each other and cause like the downfall of man, essentially, right? I think there's something to be said for just reading this short story and watching this film as nature versus man. And definitely like engage in those lenses. I think it's especially satisfying with the women, with the feminist lens that you can read the movie as, but also just take the time to like enjoy the short story on face value a little bit too. And that's how I enjoyed it. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy reading this short story, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Ciao!